Thank you very much, Danial, and thank you to Sunway for kindly inviting me to be here today. And thank you all for taking the time off to attend this event. I'm going to be brief, I hope, which is quite a challenging thing at this stage of one's life. But let me try to be brief. I think the question of poverty obviously has been with us for a long, long time. But the question is, how is poverty seen? And poverty was long seen in terms of inequality. People only feel poor relative to something else. This, I think, has been central to the tension in terms of understanding poverty. So the World Bank resisted studying and looking at inequality for ever so long. So what happened was that there was a focus on poverty. And particularly with the increasing emphasis on measurement, there was a tendency towards the fetishization of cash, making cash income. As our former Prime Minister used to say, cash is king. Okay? So you have this kind of attitude and approach and emphasis on question of cash incomes and monetary incomes. Now this poses a huge number of problems. We have a lot of people here on the panel who are authoritative, but we also have people in the audience. People like Dr. Mustafa, for example, was very, very aware of many of these challenges. And this is the major challenge for that generation, for Francis Sulaiman, Dr. Mustafa, and others who were struggling with the whole question of getting rid of poverty. At that time, when based on the 1970 population census, it was estimated that half the population of peninsular Malaysia was poor. The belief then was that the people in Sabah and Sarawak were more likely to be poor, and therefore the numbers are much higher. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that poverty, measured by cash incomes, can be useful, but can also be deceptive. And I think the work of Dr. Muhammed, for example, emphasizing the fact that many children, urban children, are actually suffering from undernutrition, is very, very important, because it reminds us that in fact you can have people who are above whatever arbitrary poverty line income you set, but nonetheless who are poor. And hence this whole question of multidimensionality arose. Tan Sri Sulaiman has reminded us that when Aziz started his work on poverty in the 1950s, he used something called the Sarong Index. And very sadly, in the last decade, when a compilation of his papers were published, five volumes of his papers were published, an exhibition was prepared, and there was mention of the Sarong Index. And sadly, Pak Unku asked for that part of the exhibition to be removed. He was embarrassed by it. And the reason why was because of this fetishization of money, okay? And the emphasis on measuring welfare and well-being in terms of money. Now we know that how misleading this can be. If we look, for example, at the well-being of children, in the late 1970s, some friends and I did some work in southern Kedah, and we found that the children in southern Kedah, the children of rice farmers, were actually healthier in terms of the anthropometric studies, the measurement of upper arm girth and so on and so forth, compared to the children of rubber smallholders. They had much better anthropometric results compared to. But the rubber smallholders, rubber smallholders' income was on average about 350 ringgit, and rice farmers on average was about 250 ringgit. 100 ringgit less. But their children were better off. Why? Because they were often catching fish in the sawah, and in the sawah at that time, that you could eat those fish, and you ate them because the fish was small. You ate them together with the bones, just like you eat ikan bilis with the bones. So you have a calcium input and so on and so forth. So all this is very important to the development of the human body. And we find that unfortunately there is very little recognition of the importance of decent nutrition in this country. We often think that people are better off simply because they have higher incomes. We also know, for example, that right now we have a lot of malnutrition, both of the undernutrition type, but also we have malnutrition of other types. Take, for example, there's one specialist in this country in government service who specializes on diabetes. Before he passed away, I went to see Abdul, Khalid, who was a senior of mine in school, and I said to him, I still remember you starting the first anti-diabetes campaign in the 1980s, and before I could say anything more, he interrupted me. Even though he was not well, he interrupted me and said, I failed miserably. Because at that time, the number of people who had diabetes, mainly type 1 diabetes, was about 8%. Today, it is about 1/4. 1/4 of the population has diabetes. And guess where the highest incidence of diabetes is? It's in Putrajaya.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And the highest incidence of overweight and obesity is also in Putrajaya. Okay? I'm not trying to shame anybody, okay? But the point is this, okay? So we begin to realize that well-being has little to do necessarily with cash incomes. Cash incomes can distort lifestyles in particular ways and with important consequences. So I really appreciate this emphasis on multidimensionality. But the big problem right now is a tendency to emphasize measurement. So, and there are many people who want to have a multidimensional poverty index instead of your poverty line income. And this is problematic because when you try to impose a universal multidimensional poverty index, it creates a lot of problems. Most of the poor people in the world actually live in the tropics. That's why the incidence of global warming is so severe. It will exacerbate well-being in many, many profound ways, especially for those of us living in the tropical zone. And this is already quite manifest in many different ways. And that's why, in a sense, we have different stakes. Developing countries have been asking for years not to allow temperature levels to go above 1.5 degrees Celsius before, compared to pre-industrial levels. But developed countries say, 2.0 is okay. Because in a sense, 2.0 is okay for them. Because, for example, I still remember when I first went to work in the UN in 2005, there was, New York Times had a 3-page feature, 3 pages in the New York Times is a lot of words, The 3 pages feature about the pros and cons of global warming included 2 major pros as far as the West was concerned. Number 1, it included a pro of the advantage of the Arctic ice cap melting and allowing ships to cross from the eastern seaboard to the western seaboard of America, for example, without having to go through Panama Canal. And this was considered to be a very major advantage. Another advantage was that the warming of the globe would result in a longer breeding period for agriculture, both plant as well as animals during the warm period, during the summer and so on and so forth. Because as you know, many animals during the winter, they tend to consume less and so on and so forth. So all this was seen as advantages of global warming. This is the kind of attitudes which you have, understandably, in temperate zones, but the consequences are quite different. So we really need to begin to think very, very seriously about dimensions and whether you can have one standard dimension for the whole world. We need to begin to think very seriously about these kinds of consequences. So I would say that rather than be obsessed about multidimensionality, about having a single composite index, we should be very, very cautious about that, but nonetheless pay attention. And this is why I tend to favor what is called a dashboard approach, where you're looking at different dimensions of poverty rather than a singular composite index, which sums up a lot of information and which really means nothing to most people. I just want to conclude with a story which is the man in charge of the statistical commission, which is making recommendations for how to measure sustainable development after the sustainable development goals were agreed to in 2015. His name is Giovanni Giovannini, and he had written a book on composite indices. He was for 15 years the chief statistician of the OECD, the Club of Rich Nations. But throughout that period, he was not allowed to introduce a single composite index because member states of the OECD realized that composite indices obscure much more than they reveal. Thank you.